Before we begin, I want you to ask yourself one question. What would you do if the person closest to you suddenly became a stranger? Because what happened next will leave you speechless.
At 68 years old, Peggy believed that love and loyalty were currencies that never lost their value. After 4 decades caring for a man, a house, and an entire life that wasn't really hers, she expected the reading of the will to be just a formality of goodbye. But as the attorney read her late husband's final wishes, in a room filled with anxious stepchildren, the silence that followed was deafening. Peggy wasn't just forgotten, she was erased, eliminated, as if 40 years of dedication could be reduced to nothing with an attorney's signature. The mansion, to the stepchildren, the bank accounts, to the stepchildren, the investments, to the stepchildren. While they exchanged victorious glances, already planning how to spend their inheritance, Peggy received what they called the rest, a rusty iron key and a hand-scrawled address for a house in a small town nobody had ever heard of. The attorney couldn't even hide his pity when he handed over the brown envelope. Peggy left that mansion where she'd lived for decades with a single suitcase, the wedding photo nobody wanted, and the profound humiliation of having been discarded by the man she'd loved with every fiber of her being. But what those arrogant heirs didn't know, what they were too young and greedy to understand, is that greed makes you blind to what truly matters. They kept the money that runs out, the mansion that ages, the investments that can disappear. But Peggy, she received the key to a secret empire her husband had protected in absolute silence for 40 years, waiting exactly for this moment, waiting for the day when she would most need to know that he had always loved her. If you've ever felt the world underestimated you because of your age, if you've been discarded by those who should have valued you, if you've thought everything was lost when it was actually just beginning, this story is for you. Welcome to Dreams Don't Age. Subscribe now, because what Peggy found when that rusty key turned in the oak door's lock will make you believe that divine justice never, ever gets the address wrong. Peggy Ann Morrison had been 28 when she married Richard Morrison, a successful 45-year-old attorney with 3 children from a previous marriage. It was 1984, and Peggy had been working as his secretary, the kind of efficient, quiet woman who made everything run smoothly without needing recognition. Richard was impressive, wealthy, respected, commanding presence in every room. When he'd asked her to dinner 6 months into her employment, she'd been stunned. When he proposed 6 months after that, she'd said yes immediately, believing she'd found both security and love in one package. Richard's children made their feelings clear from the wedding day. Stephen was 20, angry that his father had moved on. Catherine was 18, cold and calculating even then. Michael was 16, confused and resentful.
If you made it till this, comment "I'm here" below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories.
To all 3, Peggy was the secretary who'd stolen their father, the younger woman who'd somehow tricked their way into the family. "You'll never be our mother," Catherine had told Peggy at the wedding reception, her voice sweet but her eyes like ice. "Don't even try." But Peggy had tried anyway. For 40 years she tried. She remembered every birthday, attended every graduation, sent thoughtful gifts for every occasion. She hosted holidays, cooked elaborate meals, made sure their childhood bedrooms stayed exactly as they'd left them. She bit her tongue through countless cutting remarks about her background, her lack of education beyond community college, her failure to give Richard more children, and through it all, she'd built what she thought was a real marriage. She managed their beautiful Brookline mansion, a colonial house Richard had owned long before meeting her. She entertained his colleagues and clients, playing the gracious hostess who made everyone comfortable and never drew too much attention to herself. She supported his career, adapted to his schedule, remained faithful and devoted through 4 decades. Richard had been kind to her in his way. He provided well, made sure she had appropriate clothes for social events, never raised his voice or his hand. But there had always been distance. A part of himself he kept carefully separate. He traveled frequently for work, sometimes for weeks at a time. He maintained a home office that was strictly off-limits. "I need one space that's just mine, Peggy. Surely you can understand that." He kept separate bank accounts that Peggy never saw statements for. When she'd asked about their finances once early in the marriage, he'd smiled and patted her hand like she was a child asking about adult matters. "Don't worry your pretty head about money, darling. That's my job. Your job is to make this house a home, and you do it perfectly." So Peggy hadn't worried. She'd trusted completely, the way you trust someone you've pledged your life to. Even when Richard started taking weekend trips alone, once a month, sometimes more, saying he needed time to decompress at a property he'd inherited from a relative, Peggy hadn't questioned it. She'd packed his bag, kissed him goodbye, and trusted him. That trust, she would learn far too late, had been the foundation of sand on which she'd built her entire adult life. Richard Morrison died on a Tuesday morning in March, 3 months shy of what would have been his 85th birthday. Peggy found him when she brought his morning coffee, a ritual they'd maintained for 40 years, her bringing him coffee in bed at 7 a.m. sharp. He died peacefully in his sleep, the doctor later confirmed. Massive heart attack, instantaneous, no suffering. Peggy had stood there holding that coffee cup, steam still rising from it, and felt oddly disconnected. Shock, certainly. But beneath the shock was something else, something that felt almost like relief, though she pushed that thought away as soon as it surfaced. The funeral was massive. Richard had been one of Boston's top attorneys for over 50 years, and it seemed like half the city came to pay respects. Hundreds of people filled the church. Colleagues, former clients, judges, prominent families, society figures. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael sat in the front row with their spouses and children, presenting the image of a united, grieving family. They placed Peggy in the second row. "For space," Stephen had explained with a tight smile, "in case you have family members who need to sit with you." Peggy had no family. Her parents had died years ago. She'd been an only child, and 40 years of being Richard's wife had meant gradually losing touch with the few friends she'd had before marriage. The second row felt like exactly what it was, a public statement that she wasn't quite family, wasn't quite worthy of standing with blood relations in their grief. During the service, colleague after colleague stood to eulogize Richard Morrison, the brilliant legal mind, the devoted father, the pillar of the community. Not one person mentioned Richard Morrison, the husband. Not one person acknowledged the woman who'd stood beside him, supported him, built a home for him for 4 decades. At the reception afterward, held at Stephen's expensive home, Peggy overheard Catherine talking to a cluster of her friends near the catering table. "It's just so hard," Catherine was saying, dabbing at eyes that Peggy noticed were completely dry. "Losing Daddy. At least we have each other, the real family, to get through this." The real family, as if Peggy had been playing pretend for 40 years. The reading of the will was scheduled for exactly 1 week after the funeral. It was held in the downtown Boston office of Marcus Chen, the attorney who'd handled Richard's estate planning for the past 20 years. Peggy dressed carefully that morning in a simple black dress, her white hair styled the way Richard had always preferred. Her hands trembled slightly as she drove downtown, but she told herself there was no reason to be nervous. 40 years of marriage. Surely Richard had provided for her. Surely after 4 decades of devotion and service, she'd be taken care of. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael arrived together in expensive cars, with expensive lawyers trailing behind. They greeted Peggy with careful politeness and arranged themselves on one side of the conference table, a united front facing her sitting alone on the other side. Marcus Chen began with the standard legal formalities about testamentary capacity and proper execution. Then he got to the specifics, reading in the careful monotone that lawyers use when delivering information they'd rather not have to share. Richard Morrison's estate is valued at approximately $8.7 million. This includes the primary residence in Brookline, currently valued at $2.1 million, investment and retirement accounts, totaling approximately $6 million, and various other assets. Peggy felt her shoulders relax slightly. $8.7 million. That was more than enough to ensure her security for the rest of her life. Maybe Richard had been wise to keep finances private, protecting and growing this nest egg for their future. The Brookline residence, Marcus continued, his voice taking on an even more careful tone, is left in its entirety to Richard's children from his first marriage, Stephen Morrison, Catherine Morrison Grant, and Michael Morrison, to be divided equally among them or sold with proceeds split 3 ways as they determine appropriate. Cold tendrils of fear began creeping up Peggy's spine. The house? The house where she'd lived for 40 years wasn't hers? The investment accounts, totaling approximately $4.2 million, are similarly to be divided equally among Stephen, Catherine, and Michael Morrison. The cold was spreading through her chest now, making it hard to breathe. The retirement accounts, valued at approximately $1.8 million, same distribution to the 3 children. Peggy's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Marcus, I don't understand. What about me? What did Richard leave for me?" Marcus looked genuinely pained, this man who'd been to dinner parties at their house, who'd laughed at Richard's jokes, who'd complimented Peggy's cooking. "I'm getting to your specific bequest now, Peggy. I have to tell you I argued against the language Richard used, but he insisted. I'm very sorry." He took a deep breath and read from the document before him. Richard noted in his will, and I'm required to read this verbatim, "My wife Peggy Ann Morrison has lived comfortably at my expense for 40 years and has wanted for nothing during the course of our marriage. She has had the benefit of my wealth, my home, my social standing, and a lifestyle far beyond what she could have achieved on her own working as a secretary. This is more than adequate compensation for her companionship and for the domestic services she has provided over the years." Each word landed like a physical blow. Companionship, domestic services, 40 years of love and devotion and sacrifice reduced to the language of a service contract. Peggy felt the room tilting slightly. Across the table, Stephen was smiling openly now. Catherine examined her perfectly manicured nails with studied indifference. Michael had his phone out and was texting someone, probably already planning how to spend his inheritance. Marcus continued, his voice heavy with regret. "The will goes on to state, while I have appreciated Peggy's presence in my home and her efficient management of domestic affairs, I believe my primary obligation and responsibility is to my children and my bloodline. They are my true legacy, the continuation of the Morrison family name. Therefore, I leave to Peggy Ann Morrison only the following. One property I own, located at 47 Oakwood Lane in the town of Millbrook, Massachusetts, along with all contents contained therein. This property is given to Peggy with the express understanding that she will vacate the Brookline residence within 30 days of my death, as that property is needed by my rightful heirs for their use or disposition as they see fit." The silence that followed was absolute, except for the sound of Michael's phone clicking as he continued texting. Peggy sat frozen, unable to process the enormity of what she'd just heard. 40 years. 40 years of her life. And Richard had reduced her to domestic help, whose contract had expired, someone to be given minimal severance and sent away. Catherine broke the silence, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Daddy mentioned that Millbrook property to us years ago. He inherited it from some distant uncle back in the early 80s. He said it was just an old falling-apart house way out in the middle of nowhere, not worth the hassle of selling. The property taxes were probably more than it was worth." She smiled at Peggy with practiced pity. "But at least you'll have a roof over your head, Peggy. That's something." Stephen stood, already moving on to practical matters. "We'll need to discuss the timeline for vacating the Brookline house. We're planning to list it immediately. The market's very strong right now for that neighborhood. The sooner you can be out, the sooner we can get it staged and on the market." "The will specifies 30 days, Marcus said firmly, a hint of steel in his voice. "Peggy is legally entitled to 30 full days to arrange her affairs and relocate. That's non-negotiable." "Of course," Stephen said smoothly. "We're not unreasonable people. Take your full 30 days, Peggy. We understand this is a transition for you." Marcus slid a brown envelope across the polished conference table. His hand trembled slightly as he did so. "This contains the deed to the Millbrook property, now transferred to your name. There's also a key and a handwritten note from Richard that he asked me to include. Inside the envelope was an iron key, old and rusty, the kind that looked like it belonged in a period drama, and there was a single sheet of Richard's expensive stationery with his familiar precise handwriting, 47 Oakwood Lane, Millbrook, Massachusetts. Peggy, this is yours now. Go there as soon as you can. You'll understand everything once you arrive. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you before, but they were always watching, always listening, always looking for ways to challenge anything I tried to do. Trust me one last time, my darling. All my love, always, Richard. Trust me one last time." After he'd just publicly declared that she'd been nothing more than adequately compensated domestic help, after leaving her essentially homeless with nothing but an unknown property in a town she'd never heard of. Peggy stood on legs that didn't feel quite steady. She picked up the brown envelope and walked toward the door without saying a word to Stephen, Catherine, or Michael. "Peggy," Marcus called after her, "if you need anything, if you have questions about any of this, please call me." "I mean that." She nodded without turning around and walked out. She made it to her car in the parking garage before the tears finally came, sitting in her 10-year-old Honda Civic and sobbing until she had nothing left. The 30 days that followed were a masterclass in calculated cruelty delivered by people who'd perfected entitlement into an art form. Stephen, Catherine and Michael came to the Brookline house nearly every day, bringing contractors, interior designers, real estate agents, walking through rooms with measuring tapes and color swatches while Peggy was still living there. They discussed knocking down walls, ripping out her kitchen, modernizing the gardens she'd spent decades cultivating. They never asked her to leave rooms. They simply acted as if she were invisible, a ghost haunting a house that no longer had anything to do with her. One morning, Peggy was in the kitchen drinking coffee when Catherine walked through with an interior designer, not even glancing in her direction. "We'll definitely open up this whole space," Catherine was saying, gesturing broadly at walls that had held 40 years of Peggy's carefully curated family photos. "To knock out this wall, create a huge open-concept kitchen dining living area. That's what sells now." Another afternoon, a real estate agent toured the house, while Peggy sat reading in the living room. The agent and Stephen stood perhaps 3 feet from her chair, discussing staging strategies and comparable property values, as if Peggy were a piece of furniture that came with the house. "The gardens are significantly overgrown," the agent noted, looking through the window at the beds Peggy had planted and maintained for 40 years. "We'll need to bring in professional landscaping crews to clean all that up before we can list. First impressions are everything in this market." Those were Peggy's gardens, every rosebush, every perennial, every carefully chosen plant, her hands, her work, her vision. Now they were just overgrown obstacles to a profitable sale. The nights were when true fear took hold. Peggy would lie awake in the master bedroom. Stephen had graciously allowed her to stay there since the furniture needs to stay in place for staging purposes anyway, and her mind would spiral through increasingly catastrophic scenarios. She was 68 years old. She had no job, no career, no recent work experience that would mean anything to potential employers. The last time she'd worked had been 1984, 40 years ago, as a secretary. Who would hire her now? What could she possibly do? The Millbrook property was almost certainly worthless, exactly as Catherine had described. Maybe she could sell it for $50,000 or $60,000 if she was extremely lucky. That might last her 3 or 4 years if she was incredibly frugal. And then what? 72 years old and destitute? Dependent on charity or government assistance, living in some subsidized facility for the elderly poor. Some nights the fear was so overwhelming that Peggy couldn't breathe properly. Her heart would race, her chest would tighten, and she'd get up and pace the bedroom in the dark, trying desperately to calm herself down, while her mind painted vivid pictures of homelessness and despair. Other nights the fear would transform into rage so intense it surprised her. How dare Richard do this to her? How dare he let her spend 40 years thinking they were partners, building a life together, believing she was secure, only to reveal in death that she'd been nothing more than paid help? How dare he choose his entitled, selfish children over the woman who'd devoted her entire adult life to him? But rage required energy that Peggy was rapidly depleting, and maintaining anger is exhausting when you're simultaneously terrified. So mostly she just felt numb, going through the mechanical motions of packing up a life that had turned out to be built on lies. She packed 3 suitcases of clothes, throwing away most of what she owned, because what was the point of keeping it? These were the clothes Richard had wanted her to wear, the persona he'd wanted her to project. She packed 2 boxes of truly personal items, photographs from before her marriage showing her parents and her younger self, letters her mother had written her over the years, a few books that had belonged to her grandmother. That was it. 40 years of life reduced to 3 suitcases and 2 boxes. On day 28, Peggy was standing at the kitchen sink when she overheard Stephen and Catherine talking in the dining room. They either didn't know she could hear them or didn't care. "I honestly cannot believe Father left her anything at all," Catherine was saying, her voice carrying clearly. "That Millbrook property is probably worth $50,000 at most. He should have left her absolutely nothing." "He felt guilty," Stephen replied. 40 years is a long time to string someone along, even if she was essentially just the help. The Millbrook place was his way of easing his conscience without actually reducing what we got. "Well, she should be grateful we're being so civilized about this transition," Catherine said. "Most women her age with absolutely no skills and no family would end up in subsidized housing or homeless shelters. At least she'll be able to sell that dump and have a little nest egg for a few years." They actually laughed together. The casual cruelty of people who'd never struggled for anything, who'd never worried about having a roof over their heads or food to eat. Peggy stood at that sink, gripping the edge so hard her knuckles went white, and she wanted to scream. She wanted to throw something. She wanted to march into that dining room and tell them exactly what she thought of their entitlement and their cruelty and their complete lack of basic human decency. But she didn't, because 40 years of training had taught her to swallow her voice, to avoid confrontation, to be the gracious woman who never made scenes. The conditioning held even now, even after losing everything. On her final morning in the house, Peggy woke early and walked through each room one last time. She'd expected to feel profound sadness, to be overwhelmed by 40 years of memories. Instead, she felt almost nothing. The master bedroom, where she'd slept beside Richard for 4 decades, was just a room. 4 walls, a window, furniture that had never truly been hers. The guest bedrooms she'd maintained like shrines for stepchildren who'd visited as rarely as possible. The living room where she'd played hostess to people who'd barely seen her. The kitchen where she'd cooked thousands of meals that went largely unacknowledged. The only place that hurt was the garden. Standing among the roses she'd planted that first optimistic spring, the herb garden she'd created from love of cooking, the perennial beds she'd designed to bloom in sequence from March through November. This was the only space in 40 years that had felt authentically hers, and now it would belong to strangers who'd never know the woman who'd created it. At 1 p.m., Peggy loaded her car, 3 suitcases, 2 boxes. The wedding photo she'd taken from the mantel, despite Stephen's protest that it was technically house property. Stephen arrived at 1:30, early, clearly wanting to ensure she actually left on time. "The movers will be here at 2, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'll supervise everything and drop the house keys at Marcus's office this afternoon." "Stephen," Peggy heard herself say, her voice quiet, but carrying a weight she hadn't known she possessed. "Do you have any idea what it's like to give someone 40 years of your life and be told it meant nothing?" Stephen's face flushed red. "Father left you a property. You're not getting nothing." "Your father left me a mystery," Peggy said. "A house I've never seen in a town I've never heard of. You and your siblings got millions of dollars and this mansion and the satisfaction of knowing your father valued you as his legacy. I got a rusty key and 30 days to disappear from the only home I've known for 4 decades. So no, Stephen, I don't think you have any concept of what this has been like." She got in her car before he could respond, before she could say anything else, before the numbness that had been protecting her could crack entirely. The brown envelope sat on the passenger seat next to her purse. Her GPS showed the address she'd entered, 47 Oakwood Lane, Millbrook, MA. 2 hours and 14 minutes to a completely unknown future. She started the car and drove away from Brookline, from the mansion, from the life she'd thought she was living. And as she drove west through Massachusetts toward Millbrook and whatever waited for her there, Peggy Ann Morrison made herself a promise. Whatever she found at 47 Oakwood Lane, whether it was shelter or complete ruin, value or utter worthlessness, she would find a way to survive it. She was 68 years old with nothing left to lose except her dignity, and she'd be damned if she'd lose that too, because sometimes she was beginning to understand. Having absolutely nothing left to lose becomes its own peculiar kind of freedom. Millbrook, Massachusetts turned out to be exactly as small and rural as Catherine had implied, though perhaps not quite as forgotten. The main street consisted of maybe 15 buildings, clustered around a small town square. A general store with a faded awning, a diner with checkered curtains, a tiny post office, a gas station with 2 pumps, a white church with a modest steeple, a library that looked like it had been built in the 1800s, and a handful of other shops that appeared to have been there since Peggy was a child. As she drove slowly down Main Street, following her GPS directions, Peggy noticed something odd. People stopped what they were doing to watch her car pass, not with hostility or suspicion, but with something else entirely, recognition, almost, as if they'd been expecting her. An elderly man sweeping the sidewalk in front of the general store paused mid-sweep and lifted his hand in a small wave. A woman arranging flowers outside the diner turned to watch, nodding slightly as if confirming something to herself. A group of teenagers outside the library looked up from their phones with genuine curiosity, rather than the usual teenage indifference. Her GPS directed her to turn off Main Street onto Oakwood Lane, which started as regular pavement for about 200 yards, before becoming a dirt road that led into increasingly dense forest. Ancient oak trees, massive trunks that had to be hundreds of years old, lined both sides of the road, their spreading branches creating a tunnel of green shade that filtered the afternoon sunlight into patterns that danced across the windshield. The road was rough, rutted with old tire tracks, and Peggy had to drive slowly to avoid bottoming out her low-clearance sedan. After what felt like forever but was probably only about a mile, Her GPS announced in its cheerful mechanical voice, "You have arrived at your destination." Peggy stopped the car and sat for a long moment, almost afraid to look up, afraid of what she might see, or more accurately, afraid of what she might not see, afraid that Catherine had been right, and she'd find nothing but a collapsing ruin. Then she took a deep breath, lifted her eyes, and stared at what lay before her. The property wasn't what Catherine had described at all. The house sat in a large clearing surrounded by those massive oak trees, like sentinels standing guard. It was old, certainly, built from grey fieldstone that had to date back to at least the 1800s, probably earlier. 2 stories with a steep slate roof that looked remarkably intact, white-painted wooden trim around leaded glass windows, a heavy oak front door under a small covered portico with carved supports. Ivy grew up portions of the stone walls, but in a way that looked intentional, decorative, like something from an English country estate rather than abandoned neglect. The grounds immediately surrounding the house were overgrown, but clearly had once been formal gardens. Peggy could see the bones of the original design, stone pathways now partially obscured by grass, organized beds where roses bloomed wild and untamed, what looked like it had been a kitchen garden now given over to a tangle of herbs and wildflowers. There was even a fountain, silent and dry but still elegant, standing in what had obviously been a formal garden area. It was wild, yes, overgrown certainly, but it was also hauntingly beautiful, like a secret garden that time had partially reclaimed but not quite destroyed. As Peggy sat in her car trying to process what she was seeing, she heard footsteps approaching on the dirt road from the direction of town. An elderly woman was walking toward her with surprising purpose for someone who had to be in her mid-70s. She wore a simple cotton house dress and carried a wicker basket covered with a checkered cloth. "You're Peggy," the woman said as she reached the car. It wasn't a question. She said it with complete certainty, as if she'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Yes," Peggy managed, climbing out of her car on legs that felt unsteady. "How did you know?" "We've been waiting for you," the woman said simply, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Richard told us you'd come eventually after he passed. He said to watch for a woman named Peggy driving an older Honda. I'm Dorothy Harmon. I run the general store in town." She held out the basket. "Brought you some basics. Bread, eggs, milk, coffee, cheese. Figured you might need supplies. The house has been maintained, but there's no food stocked." Peggy took the basket automatically, her mind struggling to catch up. "Richard told you. When?" "He never once mentioned this place to me in 40 years of marriage." Dorothy's expression softened into something that looked like understanding mixed with pity. "Richard came here regularly for 40 years, dear. Once a month at the very least, sometimes more frequently. He maintained the house, took care of the property as best he could, spent time here. He told us that when he died, his wife Peggy would inherit this place. He said you wouldn't know about it beforehand because he'd kept it secret for your protection." My protection? Peggy felt like she'd stepped through a looking glass into some alternate reality. "Protection from what?" "From them, I imagine," Dorothy said gently. "The ones who took everything else. His children from the first marriage. Richard said they'd never accepted you, that they'd always resented him marrying you, and that if they knew about this property, they'd find legal ways to claim it. So he hid it from everyone, even you, until his death would make the inheritance final and unchangeable by any court." She started walking toward the house, gesturing for Peggy to follow. "Come on, I'll help you get settled in. The house is unlocked. Richard never locked it. He said there was nothing here anyone in Millbrook would steal, and if someone needed shelter, they were welcome to it. That's the kind of man he was, at least here." Peggy followed Dorothy up a stone pathway toward the front door, her mind reeling. Richard had been coming here for 40 years? Once a month? All those weekend trips he'd said were for work, or to visit his children, or to decompress. He'd been coming here? To a house he'd never once mentioned? To an entire secret life? Dorothy used the rusty iron key from Peggy's envelope, and it turned smoothly in the lock despite its aged appearance. The heavy oak door swung open with barely a creak, revealing the interior. "Welcome to your sanctuary," Dorothy said quietly, stepping aside so Peggy could enter first. That's what Richard called it, the sanctuary. "Welcome home, Peggy." Peggy stepped across the threshold and felt her entire understanding of reality shift beneath her feet like tectonic plates rearranging themselves. The interior was beautiful, not falling apart, not decrepit, not abandoned. Beautiful. The main floor was largely open, with wide plank wood floors that glowed with the patina of age and decades of careful maintenance. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel carved from a single piece of oak. The furniture was simple but clearly high quality, a comfortable-looking sofa covered in worn leather, several chairs positioned to take advantage of the light, built-in bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, hand-woven rugs in soft, muted colors, leaded glass windows creating patterns of filtered forest light that danced across the floors, and everywhere, covering every available inch of wall space, arranged on shelves, standing on surfaces, were framed photographs. Photographs of Peggy. Peggy on their wedding day, young and radiant and so full of hope. Peggy in the garden of the Brookline house, kneeling in the soil with dirt on her hands and genuine joy on her face. Peggy laughing at something, the camera capturing a moment of unguarded happiness. Peggy reading in a chair, afternoon sunlight catching her hair. Peggy sleeping peacefully on what looked like the porch of this very house. Peggy at different ages, in different seasons, in different unguarded moments throughout their 40-year marriage, all of them carefully photographed, beautifully framed, and displayed like a private museum dedicated to her. "He loved you very much," Dorothy said quietly from behind her. Anyone who saw this place knew that immediately. This was his shrine to you, his secret place where he could come and remember who he really was, beneath all the expectations and performance of his Boston life. Peggy's eyes filled with tears for the first time since Richard had died. She'd been too shocked at the funeral, too numb during the will reading, too terrified during the 30 days of being erased. But here, surrounded by overwhelming evidence that Richard had treasured her, that he'd built an entire sanctuary dedicated to their life together, she finally broke. Dorothy let her cry for several long minutes, then gently guided her to sit on the comfortable sofa. "Let me show you the rest," Dorothy said. "Then I'll leave you to rest and process everything. But first, you need to see it all. You need to understand what Richard really left you." She led Peggy through the house with the care of someone who'd been maintaining it for years. The kitchen was a charming blend of old and new, an antique wood stove sitting alongside modern appliances, copper pots hanging from racks, a deep farmhouse sink, open shelving displaying beautiful dishes that Peggy had never seen before. The dining room had a long oak table that looked like it could seat 12, though it was clearly rarely used for that purpose. Upstairs were 3 bedrooms, each simply but comfortably furnished. The master bedroom had another fireplace and windows overlooking the forest, and more photographs of Peggy, dozens more, including some she'd never known existed, candid shots that Richard must have taken without her knowledge, capturing her in ordinary moments of simply living her life. "The house has been maintained for years through a fund Richard established," Dorothy explained as they walked back downstairs. "He set up an arrangement with the local bank to pay for utilities, property taxes, basic maintenance and repairs. It's all covered for the next 50 years. You'll never have to worry about those expenses." "But why?" Peggy asked, her voice breaking on the question. "Why keep this place secret for 40 years? Why not just tell me about it? Why make me think I was getting nothing while his children got everything?" "Because of his children," Dorothy said gently, leading her to a door under the staircase that Peggy hadn't noticed before. Richard knew that if Stephen, Catherine and Michael knew about this property, they would find legal ways to claim it. They'd argue about marital assets and community property and divisions of estate. This place isn't valuable just because of the house itself. It's valuable because of what it contains and what it represents. Richard protected it the only way he knew how, by hiding it completely until his death made everything final and unchangeable. She opened the door to reveal a small study, maybe 10 feet by 12 feet with no windows. 3 walls were lined floor to ceiling with built-in bookshelves, but instead of books, the shelves held folders, binders and document boxes, all meticulously labeled in Richard's precise handwriting. The 4th wall contained a beautiful antique mahogany desk with a green-shaded banker's lamp and a leather chair that looked like it had been sat in countless times. And there, in the very center of the desk, positioned with clear intent, was a thick cream-colored envelope with "My beloved Peggy" written across it in Richard's familiar script. "This," Dorothy said softly, "is what he really wanted you to find. This is why he built the sanctuary." Peggy picked up the envelope with hands that trembled so badly she almost dropped it. The paper was expensive, heavy stock, the kind Richard had always used for important legal documents. He'd sealed it with actual wax, making this feel like something from another century, something precious and ceremonial. She broke the seal and pulled out what turned out to be 5 pages, covered in Richard's precise handwriting. "My dearest, most beloved Peggy," it began, And just seeing those words in his hand made tears start falling again. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've found the sanctuary. I'm desperately, profoundly sorry it had to happen this way. I'm sorry I couldn't share this place with you while I was alive, couldn't tell you about it, couldn't let you understand what I was doing all these years. But Stephen, Catherine, and Michael were always watching, always waiting for any excuse to challenge my decisions, any opportunity to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. If they'd known about this property, they would have found ways to take it. Lawyers can always find ways, as I unfortunately know too well from 5 decades of practice, so I hid it. For 40 years I hid it and protected it and prepared it for you. I've been coming to this house ever since I inherited it from my uncle Thomas Morrison in June of 1984, 3 months after our wedding. Thomas was a bachelor, a quiet historian who lived simply despite having considerable wealth. He left me this house with one instruction in his will. Protect this place for someone you love more than life itself. It deserves to shelter love, not greed. For 40 years, I've been protecting it for you. Peggy, I know what my will said. I know how much those words must have hurt you. Sitting in Marcus's office, hearing yourself described as adequately compensated domestic help. Please understand. I wrote it that way deliberately, with calculation and purpose, because I knew Stephen, Catherine, and Michael would read every word, looking for ways to challenge anything that went to you. I gave them exactly what they wanted, the visible wealth, the obvious assets, the things they could brag about to their friends and display as proof of their inheritance. I gave them the Brookline mansion that is actually mortgaged to the hilt and will cost them hundreds of thousands in property taxes, maintenance, and historical preservation requirements that I carefully built into the deed years ago. I gave them investment accounts that are locked up in complex trusts, requiring them to maintain continuous employment and pass annual character evaluations. I gave them exactly enough rope to hang themselves financially while thinking they'd won everything. But you, my most beloved Peggy, I gave you everything that actually matters. This house sits on 247 acres of protected woodland. I had the property assessed last year. It's worth approximately $3.2 million to conservation groups who have already expressed serious interest in purchasing it, though the decision to sell or keep is entirely yours. The house itself is worth another $800,000 as a historical structure, but more importantly than any monetary value, I gave you freedom. The trust fund I established will cover all property expenses, utilities, taxes, maintenance, insurance, for 50 years. You will never have to worry about money for this place, never have to fear losing it. The deed is in your name only, has been since 1984, established as a gift completely separate from our marriage. It's legally untouchable by anyone else, as my attorneys will confirm if it's ever challenged. There's more. The filing cabinets in this study contain documents I've accumulated over 40 years of legal practice, information about powerful families, influential people, those who thought their secrets were safely buried. I never used this information. That would have been unethical and wrong. But I kept it carefully documented and organized because information is insurance. If Stephen, Catherine, or Michael ever discover this property and try to challenge your ownership, if they ever try to make your life difficult or claim you somehow manipulated me, you have the means to protect yourself. The files labeled with their names contain documentation of financial dealings and personal matters. They'd very much prefer stayed private. Use it only if you must, but know that it's there. Finally, and most importantly, every single photograph in this house was taken with love. Every moment I spent here was spent thinking of you, missing you, wishing I could bring you here, but knowing I couldn't risk it until after my death made everything secure. You were the best part of my life, Peggy. The only pure, good, real thing in a life that was otherwise full of performance and obligation and maintaining appearances. I'm sorry I was too much of a coward to stand up to my children's judgment. I'm sorry I prioritized keeping peace over publicly defending the woman I loved. I'm sorry I made you feel second best when you were always first in my heart. I failed you in life by being weak. I hope I've succeeded in death by being clever. This sanctuary is yours, to live in, to sell, to transform into whatever you wish. But know that it was created from love, protected by love, and given to you with more love than I ever managed to express while breathing. You deserve someone braver than me. You deserve someone strong enough to choose you over avoiding conflict. But I gave you what I could. This place, this protection, this proof that you were cherished even when I was too weak to show it publicly. Forever and always yours, Richard. Peggy read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face, each reading revealing new layers of meaning and understanding. When she finally looked up, Dorothy was still standing quietly in the doorway, patient and kind. "He was a complicated man," Dorothy said softly. "Flawed, certainly. Weak in some ways. But his love for you was never complicated. That was the one thing he was absolutely certain about." Peggy carefully folded the letter and set it back on the desk. Then she turned to the filing cabinets Dorothy had mentioned. She opened the top drawer of the first cabinet and found exactly what Richard had described: property deeds showing her sole ownership since 1984, financial documents detailing the trust fund, legal papers confirming everything he'd written about. The second cabinet contained more sensitive material, folders labeled with names of prominent Boston families, documentation of deals and arrangements and secrets that powerful people had thought were safely hidden. The third cabinet made Peggy catch her breath, a thick folder labeled Stephen Morrison, Catherine Morrison Grant and Michael Morrison, trust documents and personal records. She pulled it out with shaking hands and sat at Richard's desk to read. What she found was devastating in its thoroughness and brilliant in its execution. The trusts Richard had established for his children weren't simple inheritances at all. They were elaborate, time-release structures with strict conditions designed to make accessing the money as difficult as possible. Stephen's $2. $8 million in investment accounts could only be accessed in $100,000 annual increments, and only if he maintained continuous employment verified by tax returns and passed annual character evaluations conducted by an independent trustee Richard had appointed, a retired judge known for taking ethics extremely seriously. Catherine's trust had similar restrictions, plus additional requirements that she maintain stable family relationships, which, given her 3 divorces and estranged relationships with her own children, would be nearly impossible to satisfy. Michael's inheritance was structured as a business investment trust that required his active, hands-on management. If he didn't personally run the investments, they would automatically dissolve and be donated to charity. The Brookline mansion they'd been so eager to get, Richard had placed historic preservation easements on it years ago, requiring any sale to go through months of committee reviews, environmental impact studies, and neighborhood approval processes. The property was also heavily mortgaged. Richard had taken out a substantial loan against it just 2 years ago that the heirs would discover they were now responsible for. Selling the house quickly would be impossible, and keeping it would be financially draining. Richard had given his children exactly what they wanted, in exactly the way that would make them utterly miserable, and he'd given Peggy freedom, security, and peace. Peggy sat in Richard's chair and started laughing. She couldn't help it. After months of shock and grief and humiliation and terror, she sat in this study in this secret house and laughed until her sides ached, until Dorothy started laughing too, both of them understanding the brilliant, patient, perfectly legal revenge Richard had orchestrated. Peggy spent her first 2 weeks in Millbrook in a kind of daze, trying to process the complete inversion of everything she'd thought was true. The house was comfortable, peaceful, isolated in the best possible way. She had everything she needed. Dorothy had been absolutely right about the maintenance fund covering all expenses. Electricity, water, heat, all functioning perfectly, all paid for through Richard's carefully established trust. The house stayed comfortably warm despite the November chill. The pantry, she discovered, had been stocked with non-perishables that would last her months. Every day Dorothy stopped by with fresh food from her garden or the store, gradually introducing Peggy to other Millbrook residents, and each person had a story about Richard. Pastor James, a kind man in his 60s, told her, "Richard funded the complete roof replacement on our church 3 years ago. Wouldn't let us put up a plaque or even acknowledge the donation publicly. He just said a church needed a sound roof to shelter its congregation." Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who'd lived in Millbrook her entire life, said, "He paid for my grandson's entire college tuition, set it up as an anonymous scholarship, but we figured out it was him. Changed that boy's whole life. First person in our family to get a degree." Sarah, the young librarian, explained, "When the town budget got cut and we were going to have to close the library, Richard bought us 5,000 new books. Just showed up one day with a check. Said a town without books wasn't really a town at all." Richard had lived a completely different life here than the one Peggy had known in Boston. Here, he'd been generous, engaged with the community, kind in tangible ways. Here, he'd been the man he'd wanted to be, instead of the man his Boston life and his children's expectations had forced him to be. He talked about you constantly, Dorothy told Peggy one evening over tea on the now cleaned stone porch. Every time he came to town, he'd stop by the store and we'd chat. He always asked if I thought the house was suitable for his Peggy, if there was anything more that should be done to prepare it. He'd show me photos on his phone and tell me stories. He said you were the only person who'd ever loved him for himself, not for what he could provide or achieve. He said keeping you secret from his children was the hardest and most important thing he'd ever done. 2 weeks after arriving in Millbrook, Peggy received a phone call from Marcus Chen. Peggy, I hope you're settling in well. I wanted to give you a heads up. Stephen called me yesterday. He's retained attorneys to challenge the will. On what grounds? Peggy asked, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. He's arguing that the Millbrook property should be considered a marital asset subject to division. He claims Richard deliberately undervalued it in the will, and that you're entitled to half of the total marital estate, while he and his siblings are entitled to the other half. He wants a court to force you to sell the Millbrook property and divide all proceeds 4 ways. Peggy smiled, looking around Richard's study at the filing cabinets full of documentation. Let him try, Marcus. I have documentation showing this property was deeded to me in 1984 as a gift, long before it could be considered any kind of marital asset. Richard set it up very carefully. I know, Marcus said, his voice warm with approval. I helped him do it. I just wanted you prepared. Stephen's lawyers are expensive and aggressive. This could get ugly. I've lived through 40 years of ugly from those people, Peggy said. I can handle this. 3 days later, a Mercedes appeared on the dirt road leading to the sanctuary. Stephen's car with Catherine and Michael in it. Peggy watched from an upstairs window as they parked and got out, looking around with expressions that shifted from arrogant confidence to confused uncertainty as they took in the beautiful stone house, the well-maintained grounds, the clear value of the property. She waited until they'd knocked on the door before she came downstairs and opened it calmly. Hello, Stephen, Catherine, Michael, she said pleasantly. Would you like to come in? They followed her inside, and Peggy watched their faces as they absorbed the interior, the quality furniture, the beautiful architectural details, the photographs of her covering every wall. She let them stand in awkward silence for a moment, then gestured toward the living room. Please, sit down. I'll make tea. She served them tea in the living room using beautiful china she'd found in the kitchen cabinets, china that had probably belonged to Richard's Uncle Thomas. She was gracious, composed, completely in control of the situation. They'd clearly expected to find her desperate and broken. Instead, she was calm, centered, obviously comfortable in this house, radiating quiet power. Stephen cleared his throat awkwardly. Peggy, we've come to discuss the property situation. We believe there's been a misunderstanding about Father's will and this property's value. Really? Peggy said, taking a delicate sip of her tea. What kind of misunderstanding? Our father clearly didn't understand the true value of this property when he left it to you, Catherine said, her voice taking on the sharp edge it got when she thought she had the upper hand. Now that we've done research and looked into it, we realize this property and land are worth considerably more than anyone knew at the time the will was written. As his children and his primary heirs, we believe we have a legal right to shares of all significant marital assets. This property isn't a marital asset, Peggy said calmly. It was deeded to me in 1984 as a gift from your father, completely separate from our marriage. I have all the documentation to prove it. We don't believe that's legally binding, Michael said, speaking for the first time. We think any gift of significant value given during a marriage should be considered joint marital property, subject to division. Then I suppose you'll have to take me to court, Peggy said simply. But before you do that, before you make that decision, I think there's something you should know. She stood and walked to the study, returning with the thick folder labeled with their names. She laid it on the coffee table between them like a weapon. This folder contains detailed documentation about the trusts your father actually established for your inheritances. Trusts with conditions and restrictions you're going to discover very soon when you try to actually access your money. It also contains information about various personal and business matters that you would probably all prefer stayed private. Your father spent 40 years as one of Boston's top attorneys, and he documented everything he learned about everyone, including his own children. He never used the information. That would have been unethical, but he kept it meticulously organized, and he left it all to me. Stephen's face had gone completely pale. You're bluffing. I never bluff, Peggy said. Your father taught me that. Stephen, There are documents in here about some of your business dealings that wouldn't look good if they became public. Catherine, your financial arrangements during your divorces weren't entirely above board, were they? And Michael, your company has some accounting irregularities that tax authorities might find very interesting. Your father collected information the way some people collect stamps. He never weaponized it because he was a better person than that. But he left me the option to use it if I needed to protect myself. She stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. So here's my offer, and I want to be very clear that this is the only offer I'm going to make. Walk away. Accept the will exactly as it was written. Live your lives with your complicated trusts and your restrictive inheritances and your historic mansion with all its expensive preservation requirements. Leave me alone in my sanctuary. We never have to see each other or speak to each other again. But if you challenge me in court, if you try to take this property from me or make my life difficult in any way, I will release every single piece of information your father collected about you. Your reputations, your social standing, your carefully maintained public images, all of it will be destroyed. Do you understand me? The room was silent, except for the ticking of an antique clock on the mantel. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael looked at each other, at Peggy, finally truly seeing her for perhaps the first time in 40 years, not as the secretary who'd married their father, not as the domestic help who'd served them, but as a woman with real power, with leverage, with documented ammunition, and with the clear will to use it if pushed. We'll need to discuss this privately, Stephen finally said, his voice tight and strained. Of course, Peggy said graciously. Take all the time you need. But I want you to understand something. This property is mine. It was always meant to be mine. Your father loved you in his complicated way, I'm sure, but he loved me more. He just didn't have the courage to show it publicly until after he was gone. They left without another word, getting into the Mercedes and driving away, the expensive car looking ridiculous and out of place on the dirt road. Peggy stood on the porch and watched them go, then went inside and sat in Richard's favorite chair by the window. For the first time since he'd died, she cried tears that weren't of grief or confusion or pain, but of pure relief and the beginning of genuine peace. 6 months later, Peggy sat on her restored stone porch watching the autumn forest transform into a masterpiece of red and gold around her sanctuary. The seasons had changed completely, and so had she. Stephen, Catherine, and Michael had dropped their legal challenge within a week of their visit to Millbrook. Marcus had handled all the final paperwork, and the will was now completely settled and closed. The Brookline mansion had eventually sold, but only after 9 months on the market, and only after the siblings discovered the substantial mortgage, the historical preservation requirements, and the countless legal fees. They'd netted far less than they'd anticipated. Their trust restrictions had proven to be exactly as complicated and frustrating as Richard had designed them to be. His revenge had been subtle, perfectly legal, and absolutely devastating. Peggy had spent the 6 months transforming the sanctuary from Richard's shrine into her own home. She'd hired workers from town to help restore the formal gardens to something approaching their original glory. The fountain now ran with clear water. The stone pathways had been cleared and relevelled. Roses bloomed in organized beds. Herbs grew in tidy rows. She'd updated the kitchen while carefully preserving its historical charm. She'd chosen new art for the walls, not replacing the photographs of herself, but adding her own choices alongside them. She'd filled the bookshelves with books she actually wanted to read. She'd added furniture that suited her comfort, rather than anyone else's aesthetic. Most importantly, she'd begun genuinely getting to know Millbrook and finding herself welcomed in ways she'd never experienced in 40 years of Boston society life. She volunteered at the library every Tuesday and Thursday. She helped out at the community center on Wednesdays. She attended the small white church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew and being greeted by name by people who genuinely seemed happy to see her. For the first time in her adult life, Peggy had real friends. Dorothy had become like the sister she'd never had. The younger generation in town sought out her advice. Children waved when they saw her walking down Main Street. She belonged somewhere, and that belonging had nothing to do with being someone's wife. One afternoon, while organizing papers in Richard's study, Peggy found one more envelope tucked into the back of a drawer, sealed and labeled, "For Peggy's future. Open when you're ready." Inside was a deed to another property, 20 acres on the edge of town with a small barn and a cottage, deeded in her name and paid in full. There was also documentation of a $500,000 trust fund, specifically established For whatever projects or purposes Peggy Morrison chooses to pursue in her new life, a note in Richard's handwriting said simply, "For your future, whatever you want it to be, build something, create something, transform something. This is your blank canvas. Paint it however makes you happy. You've spent 40 years living my life, now live yours." Peggy had smiled through tears and knew exactly what she wanted to do. She was going to create a retreat center for women who, like her, had spent their lives supporting others and needed a space to rediscover themselves. A place for widows to find community, for women leaving difficult situations to find shelter and support, for anyone who needed sanctuary and time to figure out their next chapter. She'd call it Morrison House, and it would be Richard's final gift transformed into something that helped others the way the sanctuary had helped her. As the sun set behind the ancient oak trees, painting the autumn sky in shades of orange and purple and pink, Peggy thought about the extraordinary journey that had brought her here, the devastating pain of the will reading, the profound humiliation of being erased, the absolute terror of starting over at 68 with nothing. And then the discovery, the revelation, the slow understanding that love sometimes protects itself in the most unexpected ways. Richard had been deeply flawed, weak when he should have been strong, silent when he should have spoken up, prioritizing peace over standing up for the woman